So we live. Sorry for the technical problems with the presentation. Richard, you can go on.
Okay, very good. Now, over the past 3 to 4 decades in the healthcare industry, we've witnessed a growing interest in the field of portfolio management as a discipline, concurrent with the emergence of some very well-designed portfolio management software systems. However, over the same period, the same cannot be stated of decision analysis as a formal discipline, which in the biopharma industry saw a tremendous rise in popularity during the 1980s and 1990s, but has declined somewhat over the past 2 decades. So what I'd like to do today is to examine the importance of decision analysis to the practice of portfolio management in the limited time that this presentation allows me to do so. I'd really like to begin with definitional first principles to at least see if we can agree to my definitions of both portfolio management and decision analysis, and I prefer to start with the definition of portfolio management. Now, this is a discipline that's oriented towards the active management of investments, whose consolidated purpose is to pursue the temporal attainment of strategic and financial goals under constrained resource conditions. So if we can at least accept that as a working definition of portfolio management, how would I choose to define decision analysis? Well, I choose to define that as a discipline that incorporates data and information in the form of temporal risks, uncertainties, payouts, and payoffs to facilitate logical decision-making between decision alternatives on the basis of risk-adjusted value. The risk-adjusted value metric that we normally use is risk-adjusted net present value, or ENPV, or expected net present value, as most of you may be aware of. So I'm going to look at the impact of decision analysis to portfolio management. Now, if we look at this chasm, decision analysis being to the left and portfolio management being to the right, pure logic and common sense dictate that we should look left to right. And so we cross from decision analysis to portfolio management. Now, that may be easier said than done because, in fact, over the past 13 years of my consulting life, I've come across a number of organizations, both large and small, that actually prefer to start with portfolio management and essentially worry about their data analytics later. By data analytics, I mean the pedigree of the data that they use, the veracity of the data that they employ, the defensibility of the data. I'm not speaking about exactness or precision. It's simply about the pedigree, the veracity, and the robustness of that data. Now, that works for some organizations. It doesn't necessarily work for me because my predisposition is to start here. And that is in the area of decision analysis, and to worry first and foremost about data integrity, the pedigree of the data, and then to address portfolio selection later on. Now, let me give you a brief introduction to the formal discipline of decision analysis as I have been taught it and I know it. It is a discipline that's divided, in fact, into 2 subdisciplines. Normative and descriptive theory. The first describes how decisions should be made. The second describes how decisions are actually made. Now, decision analysis, or DA, is an iterative process that enables decision makers to gain better insight as time unfolds and both risk and uncertainty are resolved. It therefore allows you to determine how much you would pay for additional information to reduce uncertainty. The discipline allows you to decompose complex problems into phase-dependent subproblems, which lend themselves to increased clarity for better valuation and decision-making. Not surprisingly, therefore, decision analysis has a perfect home in high-risk and high-uncertain industries like oil and gas and drug development, for example. Now, decision analysis logically integrates what you value, what courses of action you can take, that is, what decisions you are in control of, and what uncertainties you're not in control of. One of the many features of DA is that through sensitivity analysis, it enables you to concentrate on what is important and maybe decision relevant, as opposed to what is less important. With the aid of strategy tables, which I will discuss later on in the presentation, decision analysis enables the generation of strategic alternatives for research, development, registration, and commercialization. Now, please note that discipline does not in of itself guarantee a successful outcome to a decision. It merely addresses the goodness of that decision. So it is a discipline that's intended to aid good decision making. And while, for example, in the healthcare industry, many of us are essentially perplexed by the complexity of decisions that we make, we tend to be far too preoccupied with making the right decisions. Well, decision analysis can help you eventually get there, but the primary focus of DA is not on making the right decisions. It is addressing the goodness of a decision, or in fact enabling you and others to make good decisions. So what is a good decision? Well, I choose to define a good decision as the process of integrating defensible, decision-relevant data and information in a logically consistent manner, lending itself to a decision that is transparent and reproducible. So irrespective of the outcome of the decision, which is a future event, you would take the same decision, which is basically your current event. So if that's a good decision, what is a bad decision? Well, it is simply the antithesis of a good decision, where in fact there's a lack of process and adherence to defensible decision-relevant data and information, essentially lending itself to a decision that is far from transparent and non-reproducible, and essentially dominated by heuristics, opinions, politics, and advocacy. Now, the goal of good decision-making is to minimize both type 1, that is false positive, and type 2, that is false negative errors. Now, decision quality, there are 6 dimensions, and many of you may, in fact, be quite familiar with the concept of the DQ, or decision quality cycle. There are multiple dimensions here that decision analysis addresses. They begin with setting the right decision frame, that is, what problem we're going to solve. The 2 areas I will touch on today are the creation of strategic alternatives and the validation of data and information, establishing desired values and trade-offs, the application of logically correct reasoning, and the execution and tracking of your decision outcome. There is a potential range of use cases for decision analysis. We don't have the time to go through all of these, but I'm simply aligning you to the purposes, in fact, in the leftmost column as I describe here. Starting with the relationships between decisions, uncertainties, payouts, and payoffs, looking for dominant strategic alternatives and the basis of risk-adjusted net present value, project and program level analysis, correlated and non-correlated risk analysis, the incorporation of new imperfect clinical information such as proof of concept studies. Many of us are engaged in indication sequencing, that is, which disease do we target first, second, or third, and not surprisingly, the option value of making continued investments. Now, there are various processes involved with each of these purposes. There are a number of different techniques that could be applied to each, and a number of different tools that we can apply to those processes in fulfillment of these purposes. Not surprisingly, the decision tree a major component of decision analysis finds its way into each of these purposes. So as I've explained earlier, the one area that in fact I will address is looking at dominant strategic alternatives. Now, a strategy table. Some of you may have used this. This is a simple but a very powerful tool to create strategic alternatives from decisions where you have options. If you don't have options and therefore 0 degrees of freedom, don't bother yourself with the application of a strategy table. It'll simply be a waste of your time. But if you do have degrees of freedom, where you can pick from a variety of different options, then a strategy table can become one of your best friends in the field of decision analysis. Now, let's assume for a moment that you are, in fact, initiating a project where you're looking at the development of a drug. You're in the process of creating strategic alternatives, and now you have control in the decision regarding what strategy you want to pursue. Now, let's assume you wish to take a leadership strategy, however you define it, or a followership strategy, or an options approach where phase by phase you invest a little, learn a little before making a further commitment. So let's just assume that these are 3 strategic alternatives that are available to you for the purposes of essentially developing and commercializing a product. Let's call it a drug product. So what I'm going to do here is describe how a strategy table is actually developed and utilized for the purposes of creating these 3 strategic alternatives for a drug for a single indication or disease. We begin left to right with strategic decisions 1 through 4. There's an early clinical decision, a late clinical decision, a registration decision, and a commercialization decision. Leftmost column, these are the 3 strategic alternatives that I've given names to. You can call them ABC, XYZ, 1, 2, 3, it doesn't matter. Some of us can also call some of these high risk, moderate risk, and low risk. So these are your strategic decisions, and these are your strategic alternatives. Now let's look at your options or strategic options for each one of your strategic decisions, and let's begin with the early clinical. To this organization or this company, there are 2 degrees of freedom or 2 options that are available to it. They are described as follows: conduct phase 1, then do phase 2A, or conduct phase 1 and phase 2A concurrently. Those are the only 2 strategic options that the organization is willing to consider, or that the project team is willing to consider. Clearly, there are others. Late clinical, something similar to what we saw before. Sequentially conduct phase 2B, then phase 3, or jump straight into phase 3. 3 options now regarding registration, not 2 as before. Register in the US only, register sequentially in the US, then Europe, then Asia, or go the whole hog and register, in fact, in all 3 regions concurrently. And lastly, there are 3 commercialization options. You may build your own sales force, you may partner with someone else's sales force, or you may contract a sales force. Now, between these 2 by 2 by 3 by 3, you now have 36 collectively exhaustive strategic alternatives from a very simple strategy table that addresses these 4 strategic decisions. Now, I encourage you not to spend your time trying to generate 36 collectively exhaustive alternatives and valuing them. That will consume a tremendous amount of time. So the rule of thumb that I use and many of my colleagues in decision analysis use is to generate around 3 to 5 strategic alternatives. In this case, I've made the table simple and I've only developed 3. The only challenge now is how do we link the options within each strategic decision to the theme that is a leadership theme or a followership theme or an options approach theme within the strategic alternatives column. Let's start with leadership. So a leadership strategic alternative could be conduct phase 1 and 2A concurrently, move directly to phase 3, register in all 3 regions concurrently, and build your own sales force. There's nothing right or wrong about this linkage. This is the way the team or the organization is determined. That is how the leadership strategic alternative would be basically comprised. Compare that with the followership alternative, which is to do the same in early clinical, but instead of moving directly to phase 3, conduct phase 2B, then 3, do the 3 regions sequentially, not concurrently, and don't build your own sales force, but instead partner with someone else's. Now, how do these 2 compare with an options approach? Do the sequential phase 1, then 2A, do the sequential 2B, then 3, now focus in the US only, don't build or partner, but essentially hire a contracted sales force. This is essentially how 3 really robust strategic alternatives from the list of 36 could be created. Now, the challenge is going to be to value them, and on the basis of risk-adjusted value, determine which is the dominant alternative. So how does the leadership strategic alternative look with the application of decision analysis, in this case, decision tree analysis? Now, before I move to the next slide, please note, we're doing 1 and 2A concurrently, then moving to 3, doing all 3 regions from a registration perspective concurrently, and then building our own sales force. This is what the leadership decision tree alternative looks like. So that's the decision to pursue leadership. We'll look at the other 2 in a moment. You do your early clinical concurrently. You move to phase 3, that is late clinical, and then you try to register in all 3 regions concurrently. We need to account for the mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive outcomes to this uncertainty. That is an example of how the decision tree vis-a-vis decision analysis essentially quantifies and values the strategic alternative that we generated from the aforementioned strategy table. So if that's the leadership alternative, then what does the followership alternative look like? Once again, we can see the logic from 2 or 3 slides ago. We basically try to register in the US first, then Europe, then Asia. And finally, the options approach. Sequentially do the early clinical, that is phase 1, then 2A, sequentially do late clinical, that is 2B, then 3, and register in the US only. Now, what is the real value of doing multiple strategic alternatives for a single project? Why don't we just do a yes-no, generate what you think is your best alternative, and move the governance perhaps at a stage gate review, so that your project can be included in the portfolio or essentially progressed beyond its current phase? Well, in fact, when you generate multiple strategic alternatives, project teams get multiple shots on goal. And in fact, you offer up to governance a richer plate of alternatives to choose from for the purposes of portfolio selection. So imagine 2 projects coming up for stage gate reviews or entry decisions into the pipeline or portfolio. They simply have yes, no, binary outcomes. So the consequence of that is each project has only one shot on goal, and governance has 4 decisions to choose from. Yes, 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 no, no, yes, and no, no. Take the same 2 projects, use a strategy table, create strategic alternatives in the simple manner that I described earlier. And now we're looking at not just yes, but if yes, how? And I'm going to stick with the leadership, followership, and options approach. And now your project teams have 3 shots on goal, not just 1. And now governance has 16 decisions to choose from, not just 4. These ensure that there's a wealth of possibilities vis-a-vis the permutations that you're offering to senior management for the purposes of portfolio value maximization. Now, clearly, if you're in the bowels of project prioritization, then this can become a nightmare for you. Those of us who are in the game of portfolio optimization, quite frankly, love the opportunity to choose between multiple mathematical permutations in an effort to maximize portfolio value. Now, the prior 3 slides on this one mistakenly create the impression that the data is all readily available. Well, as we all know, far more often than not, the data is not readily available. There are biases in all of the data and information that we get. And so one of the challenges of decision analysis, not necessarily of portfolio management, is to address the level of bias, both motivational and cognitive, that could impact the robustness of that data and information that we utilize for the purposes of our evaluations and therefore our analyses. Motivational bias comes in the form of 4 major buckets. That is personal interest and commitment, perceived reward structures, expert and inexpert bias, while cognitive bias comes in 3 main buckets. That's availability of information, the representativeness of that information, and anchoring and adjustment. Now, if you don't have data vetting and validation, if you don't try to minimize biases in the data of information that you are presented with, what happens? Who wins? Well, the simple fact of the matter is, and I'm confident I'm not the only one who has either been the victim of this or have in fact observed this, if you don't apply a process of checks and balances, invariably the bully with the big stick wins. This is what we should often try to avoid when we are trying to get the best data and information that we have at hand. So welcome to the world of Sisyphus. Those of us who've been doing portfolio management, either for a short or a long time, and I've been doing it for decades, know well that this issue of building a portfolio management function and making it thrive in an organization can become quite a Sisyphean task. You and I know the consequences of what happens here when you're being asked over and over again by senior executives, what is your value proposition? Demonstrate it to us on an ongoing basis. And just when you think executives understand your value proposition, there's a change in leadership and you have to do it over and over again. Well, if this looks and feels quite familiar to you, don't be terribly upset. Take some comfort in the fact that you're simply not alone. Now, who needs to be involved and why? And this is simply a process question. This is not about getting data or analyzing data. This is about roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities. So let's see who these 5 folks are. 1 is project management. So clearly, project management, developing project charters and development plans, They basically house a lot of the information that's necessary to essentially value a project. There are forecasting people that look at the value of the project. There are resource management functions that tell you what functional roles are going to be involved in the research, development, and commercialization of a project. And then there's finance that does its thing with respect to cost and other areas necessary to portfolio management. So who is the individual in blue? Well, that person can be one of two people, either a portfolio manager, or as my preference becomes, both a decision analyst and a portfolio manager. The process that I've seen work well in companies is when these four functions at a minimum clearly understand their roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities for providing the right type of data to the individual responsible for decision analysis and portfolio management to ensure that the valuations are done smoothly, the right opportunities are presented from the project teams to governance for the purposes of decision making, and that portfolio management can become a relatively seamless discipline. However, if you don't address the need for good process to assure alignment, then a number of questions generally emerge. Who is really responsible for doing what? Who is really accountable for what as opposed to merely being responsible? Then who is responsible for giving what to whom and by when? What does ownership have to do with ensuring the provision of deliverables? Next question, are we part of the same team, striving to achieve the same end? Or are we fiefdoms pretending to be part of the same team? And lastly, who are we ultimately accountable to? Now, if you don't address these process questions appropriately in portfolio management, you generally suffer. And how have I seen this suffering manifest itself? In what I describe as a fool with an expensive PPM tool. So if you don't address the process of getting the right data and information to ensure that you can do a good decision analysis and help your executives or your governance make good decisions, you'll basically be confined to making glossy charts, not attesting to the pedigree of the data that goes into one end of your fabulous PPM system. And essentially what happens is it's not a matter of data not being available. It is more a matter of data being kept by certain functions so close to their chest that models never become available until the 11th hour. Data and assumptions don't become available until way after the 11th hour, and you are left at the mercy of a very well-built and sophisticated PPM system that generates fabulous charts, but clearly does not address and should not address the pedigree of your data. So, where do you or where does your organization find itself in the capability maturity curve, starting with CMM level 1 and moving all the way up to CMM level 5? Clearly, everyone wants to go left to right. There are times when you achieve a higher capability maturity level and you simply have to do a tremendous amount of work to stay still. There are also times where you lose executive sponsorship. And even though you're working very hard, don't be surprised if you regress as a CMM level. This happens far too often in my own experience. But if you are willing to address where you are and analyze where your gaps are, you can use, in fact, a decent diagnostic tool. I have my own, many other people have theirs. This is simply a representation, a synopsis of one that I use, 9 primary dimensions, and each primary dimension has its own subdimensions that allow you to assess and address where you are, in fact, along the capability maturity continuum with respect to portfolio management. Now, in my final slides, I will posit that your investments in decision analysis and portfolio management will help to shape your competitive positioning. You can either proactively determine that you wish to be a leader, some type of follower, or a laggard where in fact you're perfectly happy with being good enough until in fact a crisis emerges, or really do nothing and be content with the status quo. And then determine the extent to which you make bounded rational decisions that leave value on the table. Bounded rational decisions occur here in this yellow zone of satisfaction, where you're operating with inefficient portfolios that do actually provide good value to the organization, but don't provide the best or maximum value vis-a-vis the efficient frontier. Those of us who work in the area of portfolio optimization, we work in the efficient frontier. We're always trying to maximize value given an investment constraint or any other resource constraint. Those of us who do a lot of project prioritization generally work in this yellow domain of satisfaction. So that's the end of my presentation. This is who I am, and these are my coordinates. We haven't yet had any questions, but to those of you on the line, I'd like to thank you for time and attention, and hope we'll get a couple of questions. And before I finish, just one more slide.
Thank you, Richard.
I would like to, in fact, make a note by inviting you to consider, for those of you who may be interested in attending the next Decision Analysis and Portfolio Management Masterclass that has been put together by Y Summits and PPVC. The first one took place in November of 2020. The next one will take place in April 27th through 30th over 4 half days. And that was my final slide. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Richard. We had one question on stage. Nicole has asked, what would be the first step for implementing this methodology in an organization that isn't that mature yet?
So I get the question quite frequently. Let me thank the person for the question with respect to the maturity of an organization. The best types of decision analysis and portfolio management processes are oriented around the maturity of organizations with respect to what in fact they are prepared to invest in, but they have to define what their desired states are year by year. Neither DA nor portfolio management is a one-time event. You don't build this discipline over 1 year. In fact, it is a multi-year discipline that you build. So based on maturity, there are clarifying questions that need to be asked with respect to what is your desired state 1 year from now? What questions are you trying to answer? What problems are you trying to solve? And then both DA and portfolio can begin at a level that is reflective of what your executives will embrace. There is, for example, no value whatsoever in providing senior executives, as educated as they may be, with in fact a wonderful simulation analysis if they are not ready in fact, for the consequences of a simulation analysis. And it may well be that doing an analysis in Excel is good enough for them. So it depends on what it is that the organization wishes to be, let's say a year from now, what questions it's trying to answer, and what problems it's trying to solve. Once those are done in year 1, then we can always look at ways of improving the maturity of that organization with respect to both disciplines, that is, decision analysis and portfolio management.
Thank you, Richard. Richard is a trainer with extensive experience in decision making. If you would like to learn more about decision making, please visit our masterclass at Expo area, where you get more information on dates and classes. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Have a nice day.
And you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.